Come with joy to Yahweh. We sang a song this morning, Come Let Us Sing, and it's going to be, and Chris didn't plan this, it's going to be the major theme of our study this morning. If you have your Bibles, turn with me to Psalm 95. Psalm 95. Come, let us sing with joy to Yahweh. Let us shout aloud to the rock of our salvation. Let us come before him with thanksgiving and extol him with music and with song. For Yahweh is a great God, a great King above every God. In his hands are the depths of the earth. The mountain peaks, they belong to him. The sea is his, for he made it, and his hands form the dry land. Come, let us worship and bow down. Let us kneel before the Lord, Yahweh, our Maker. For he is our God, and we are the people of his pasture and the sheep of his hands. Every person alive is worshiping this morning. Every single being that walks the face of this earth is worshiping. Whenever we think of the idea of worship, it is to ascribe absolute reverence to a person or an object. Anybody remembers the first Harry Potter book? In the first Harry Potter book, there is this, relic, for lack of a better term, called the Mirror of Erised. Now, the Mirror of Erised, I want to ruin something for people. Do you guys know why it's called the Mirror of Erised? It's desire spelled backward. The Mirror of Erised was something that whenever you looked into it, you would see whatever your heart desired the most. When Harry looked in it, because his parents had died, he saw him there with his parents. If you remember, he goes and grabs Ron, his best friend, because this is so neat. He wants his friend to see his parents, but when he goes and grabs Ron, Ron looks in the mirror and he sees himself as basically an athlete and important in the school. And the idea was, whatever you desired the most is what you would see in the mirror. Whenever you look in the Mirror of Erised, you see what you worship, what you ascribe value to, what you think is important, what your heart wants the most. And like I said, everyone's worshiping something this morning, but what's important is, what is the object of your worship? The psalmist here lays out something, an idea that would have been very important. We believe Psalm 95 was written before the exile. And if you remember, the big problem prior to the exile was this idea of synchronism. So synchronism is a fancy term of saying, if one is good, more is better, right? In the eyes of a lot of the Israelites post-Solomon, and we found some neat archaeological evidence of this, most of them did say, yes, Yahweh is the God of Israel. Okay, that's good. But what they would also do is, just in case Baal was also a god, they would also have some Baal idols. And maybe Asherah can get them something that they need. So they would have an Asherah pole. And they would combine all these things together. But what the psalmist says here is, no, the Lord is a great God. He's a king above all the other gods. In his hands are the depths of the earth. You have a mountain god? No. The mountain peaks belong to God, Yahweh. The sea is his. You have a sea god? No. Yahweh made the sea. And you've got the plains where you grow crops. You've got a God for that? No. God, Yahweh, his hands formed the dry land. All that you see was created by him and for him. He goes on to say, let us kneel before the Lord our God, our Maker. So he made the mountain peaks. He made the seas. He made the land. He made you and me. Yet the object of worship today, many times, is not the Lord. Everyone worships. Everyone has something that they put first. Everyone has something that holds their desire, and they follow after that. Whatever you ascribe the highest value to, that's what you worship. A lot of times you can tell what people worship by the way that they act. You ever seen anybody who, I want to go ahead and say it. You ever been in a men's business meeting where somebody, all they want to talk about is how much something's going to cost? If all you can think about is the price and what it's going to cost and what it's going to take and what might happen to the funds, what do you think their God really is? Have you ever seen anybody who is in a long-term relationship with somebody and they lose that relationship, and for the next 6 months to a year do nothing but weep over that relationship? What do you think they've made their God? If you see somebody who is missing church to go do something else, maybe that's a sporting event, maybe that's, I know when I was living in Tennessee, a lot of, they had basketball AAU things where people would travel for that and not attend services while they were gone. What do you think your God's become there? Because children are great, but we don't worship our children. Everyone worships something. The question is your object of worship correct? Are you really putting God first? Because if you're truly putting God first, we should be able to see by the life that you live, the things that you do, whether or not he really is your God. So we have to figure out the correct object of worship. We also have to figure out the correct method of worship. Now, if you remember 6 months ago, I said, I'm not going to talk about a cappella music and it being the only pattern in the New Testament for at least 6 months. Okay, this is your friendly 6-month reminder. We don't use instruments here. That's not what I want to talk about. Whenever we think about the story of Nadab and Abihu, it's usually looked at in the context of they offered a false fire, therefore they were punished. That's a true statement. But have you ever considered the things that led up to that event? Whenever we think about the worship that they were offering, they had to make a decision before they ever went there. Before they ever went into the holy place to offer that, they had already made up the decision that they wanted to do things their way, that their heart and their desires were more important than the instructions that God had given them. A lot of people throughout the history of the churches of Christ have said, if we get the form right, if we get the things, the form, the way that you're supposed to worship, if we get that right, we'll be okay. That's what we've got to get right. If we're not worshiping Him in spirit and in truth, it doesn't matter if we use an instrument or not. It's wrong. And here in Psalm 95, the psalmist gives us a little bit of a pattern that if you're not paying attention, you'll miss this. He says, "Come, let us sing with joy to the Lord. Let us shout aloud to the rock of our salvation. Let us come before Him with thanksgiving." We worship together. Now, we worship individually, but I heard this thought from one of my teachers, and I'm almost to the point where, I think I agree with that. When we worship by ourselves, it's really something to help us worship as a group better. It's something to help us whenever we come into the corporate worship to show our desires and our love for God to those around us. There was an interesting story about C.S. Lewis. C.S. Lewis was in a group of people. If you remember, with Tolkien was another one in this kind of dinner group. And C.S. Lewis, he had a friend named Charles. And Charles was really good friends with one of his other friends. And I think his name was Robert. So Robert dies. And C.S. Lewis, he thought, well, maybe since he's gone, I'll get to spend more time with Charles now. Because before, he was kind of having to split time. And what he found out, Charles wasn't the same without Robert there. He wasn't the same person. He didn't bring out some things in Charles. He wasn't there to bring out some things in Charles that made Charles the person that C.S. Lewis liked. When we worship together, there's things that we draw out of each other as a community that cannot be drawn out except by our brothers and sisters in Christ. There's things that we have to be together to truly take advantage of, to truly bring a worship before God that's acceptable. I've also heard people say, well, it's not how good we sound that's that important anyway. Why are you having singing practice on Friday nights or things like that? Because it's not important how we sound. I would say, yes, I agree. But if I came to worship this morning, I know I probably dress up more than most people, but if I came and I hadn't combed my hair, hadn't taken a shower, and, maybe I wouldn't have had a tie on. Maybe I came with a t-shirt and sweats. Didn't brush my hair. Looked like I just rolled out of bed. What's the classic thing that people say that we should do on Sunday morning? Why we have Sunday morning clothes? We need to give God our best, right? Why is it that it's important for us to give God our best in regards to how we dress, how we look, being here on time, but somehow we justify not giving it our best whenever we worship Him in our song? I find a problem with that. I take issue with that. We need to give Him our best in every aspect, because in those cases, the person that worship becomes appealing to and important to is you. If you're willing to say second best is good enough, what you're willing to say is, it's more important that I get it to the point where I feel okay than it is for me to actually give God what He desires. Along the lines of the method of worship. Paul, writing to the Corinthian church in 1 Corinthians 14 and 15, he says, I will pray with the Spirit, but I'll pray with my mind or intellect also. I will sing with the Spirit, but I'll sing with my mind also. Whenever we come to worship, there's two aspects that we always need to keep in mind. There's the aspect of this is something that we are doing to help us realize and recognize that God's presence is among us when we're worshiping. There's also the aspect of we need to think about what we're doing. Unless you have both, you don't have worship that's acceptable to God. You see some of these very charismatic type movements where you've got dancing, people running up and down the aisles. They have completely shifted the one way. I won't say they're necessarily feeling the presence of God, but they think they're feeling the presence of God in that community. And they've completely left the intellectual part of it behind. Then you've got other people who swing completely hard right, where they say, well, the reason that we sing these songs is to think about the words and to meditate completely on them. And really, it's not so much what the music or the tune, it's entirely on what they say. You ever wondered why God chose the reasons to have us worship the way that we do? You know why I'm able to quote the first 7 verses of Psalm 95 without having to look at them at all and without having any problems with it? I never sat down and memorized Psalm 95, 1 through 7. Anybody want to guess? I learned 2 songs. And those 2 songs are Psalm 95, 1 through 5, and then 6 and 7. So there is an intellectual aspect to it, but the reason that I can remember it is the tune that it was set to. And when I sing that song, I feel what it means to be a Christian. It means to think about God as the creator and to look at all these things that he's done in pure awe, reverence and awe, because he's a consuming fire. Whenever we come to worship, it's not just a feeling. It's not just our mind and our intellect. We have to have both if we want worship that's desirable to God. So we talked about the object, the method, and then the purpose. Why do we worship? The psalmist here gives us several reasons. He starts out by saying, he's the rock of our salvation. Okay? He goes on to talk about he's the one who created all these things. I really think he hits on it whenever he says, let us kneel before the Lord our God, our Maker. We are created in the image of God. We are supposed to be reflections of God the Father. We're supposed to be representations here on earth of God. He wants us to be like him. So whenever we worship him, we do things that he desires. He wants our worship. But it also helps us become more like him. He goes on to say, we are the people of his pasture and the sheep in his hand. We need to worship God because of who he is. We also need to worship God because of who we are. We're Christians. We are the living image of God here on earth. And as his church, we are his body. And we're supposed to be ambassadors of heaven here on earth. We're supposed to show people what it means to be the kingdom of God. We're the outpost. And we're supposed to be slowly edging those borders wider and wider till more and more of the world is consumed by his awe and might and power. That's why we worship. If I took the mirror of Erised and I set it in this room this morning, what would you see? Because if you truly are worshiping God the way that you're supposed to when you come here on Sunday morning, all you should see is your reflection. Because if you've truly set your desire to worship God the way that he would have us worship him, we are already putting our desire where it should be. God created us to worship him. Are you worshiping him today? Are you worshiping him correctly? Are you really putting him first? This morning we have an opportunity. We have an opportunity to make him the object of our worship, the eternal object of our worship. And we'll continue the worship that we have this morning throughout the rest of our days, throughout eternity, in his presence. Are you ready to do that this morning? If not, please come.